Hello everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, an investigative true crime series exploring the murder of Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 and the trial of his convicted killer, Sirhan. Please take a moment to subscribe to my channel if you're not already, smash that like button, and share the playlist link, which is down in the comments section, with anyone that you think might find this series interesting so that they can listen to every episode back to back. Producing this series involved 35 years of research, 7 months of interviews, endless hours of editing, and a lot of reading government documents, which can be tedious at times. It's a ton of hard work, and I do it for free as a labor of love. My only reward is sharing knowledge with the public and the kind comments that I receive from viewers like you. So if you'd like to support my efforts with a donation, it would be very much appreciated. Check out my wish list at giftapp.com/real-Lori-Spencer, where you can select a book that you'd like me to consider for a future book club reading. There are lots of great Kennedy family history books there to choose from. You can also buy me a coffee or visit patreon.com/Lori-Spencer. So far, this series has 13 episodes, and I thought the story was complete when we wrapped production last year. I felt satisfied at the time that I'd reported everything you'd ever want to know about the RFK assassination, but that was before President Donald Trump signed an executive order on January 23rd, 2025, commanding federal agencies to release all of their files on the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It took another 3 months after the signing of that executive order for the long-awaited RFK files to actually be released, the first tranche of them anyway. On April 18th, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard announced the release of the first 10,000 pages, and of course, I couldn't wait to dive in. It took about 3 weeks for me to plow through all 10,085 pages to be exact. And in this new episode of the series, episode 14, I'll show you what I found in those dusty old file boxes and share with you what, if any, new light these documents shed on this historic murder case. I've selected a couple hundred of the most interesting documents, and I'm just going to walk you through them in this episode one by one. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio-only podcast platform like Spotify, I might recommend watching the video version instead over on my YouTube, Rumble, or on my Substack so that you can actually see the pages as I put them on the screen. We will be moving through these fairly quickly, so at times you might want to pause the video if you want a closer look at a specific document. I will also put down in the comments section a thread that I posted on X, formerly known as Twitter, that contains screenshots of every document you see here in this video. That might help you zero in on exactly the file you want without endlessly searching the internet for a copy of it. Of course, you can browse through and download all of the 10,000 RFK files yourself at archives.gov/RFK. That's archives.gov/RFK. As far as redactions go, these files so far are totally unredacted, and that is a triumph for historians and researchers like me who have waited decades for fully unredacted versions of some key documents. Going through these, the only things I've seen in the files that are redacted are things like social security numbers and other personally identifying information on living persons, who of course would be protected by privacy laws. One other important thing that I should probably explain before we get started. Of these 10,000 pages that were just posted, not all of these documents are new. I'd say that at least half of these files are actually just duplicates of documents that have already been public for 35 years. Since the California State Archives finally opened their case files back in 1988, a lot of these pages that we're now finding in the National Archives are just file copies that were sent to the FBI from the Los Angeles Police Department, the LA District Attorney, and the courts before and during Sirhan's 1969 trial. Many of these documents are certainly not new to experienced RFK assassination researchers, but some of them might be new to you if you've never seen them before. And each page tells a fascinating story about this tragic murder of President Kennedy's brother. Such a turbulent time in American history of riots, protests, and assassinations at home, wars overseas in Vietnam and the Middle East, the latter of which drove Sirhan to martyr himself for the Palestinian cause by killing Senator Kennedy over his support for Israel. Sirhan's mother, Mary, once called the assassination of RFK a patriotic act. The documents that are new, that the public has never seen before, are boxes of files from the White House, the Department of Justice, and the State Department. Because these federal agencies were not connected in any way to Sirhan's prosecution, in 1968, murdering a presidential candidate was not a federal crime. It was a state crime, and thus the federal government was largely uninvolved in the case itself. The FBI did assist the LAPD in the initial investigation at the LAPD's request, which is why we have some overlap and duplicates of FBI files from the California State Archives collection. I realize that might be a bit confusing if you're not expert level in the RFK case, but hey, if you've watched 13 episodes of this series so far, you're almost an expert already. You're well informed, you're armed with plenty of knowledge to help you understand the context and assess the importance of these new RFK file releases. Hopefully, this brief introduction clears up the difference between what is new and what was previously available. And if you have any questions about the documents covered here or the RFK files in general, just drop me a comment down below. Of course, the most frequently asked question I've been getting lately is, well, are there any smoking guns in these new RFK files? Are there any proofs of a conspiracy or not? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that once you've watched this episode and looked at these documents for yourself. As I've said throughout the entire Who Killed Bobby Kennedy series, my job as a journalist and a historian is just to present the evidence and let the viewers decide, because ultimately you, the people, are the jury. And now, let's open up those file boxes that have been sitting in a federal storage facility somewhere in Maryland collecting dust for 57 years and take a look inside, shall we? So let's start here. This is just a letter from a concerned citizen to the Attorney General of the United States under LBJ, Ramsey Clark. It's dated June 6, 1968. That is the day RFK died, urging him to investigate Sirhan's potential ties to Palestinian terrorist organizations. This is a really interesting letter. It just jumped out at me because this person, even though it's, the trauma is fresh and Americans are still trying to gather all the facts about the alleged accused assassin, and this person really seems to understand the bigger picture of what's going on that would take most Americans years to figure out. It reads, "Dear Sir, it is my earnest belief that the security of our country is directly involved in the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, and that these security interests require a thorough interrogation of the suspect, Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, by you and your staff. I base my contention on the following considerations. First, Sirhan is quoted as shouting at the time of the shooting, 'I did it for my country.' Since he has never become a citizen of the United States, his loyalty is obviously directed elsewhere. Second, $400 was found in his possession at the time of his capture, a sum that strongly suggests that he had been subsidized. Third, a woman in a polka dot dress was seen in his company prior to the shooting, and afterward she is said to have boasted of the crime. Fourth, Fedayeen, guerrilla units, have sprung up in great numbers throughout Jordan, and their raids into Israel have multiplied. Since these activities have been amply financed by the oil-producing states, the possibility of an international Arab conspiracy cannot be dismissed out of hand. Holding the key to this mystery is the prisoner, Sirhan. Certainly he must not be allowed to carry such crucial secrets to his grave as Lee Harvey Oswald did. Certainly the United States, which has already lost so much at his hands, dare not risk losing more of its valued leaders through the failure of extracting from Sirhan all that he knows. This part's kind of interesting. I believe that hypnotic drugs such as sodium pentothal should be administered to facilitate the eliciting of information. If this information is withheld from the courts, but used instead as a means for apprehending collaborators, if they exist, the prosecution against him should not be hampered or prejudiced in any way. He concludes other lives may well depend on how competently the security aspect of this case is conducted. Do you not agree that such a critical matter requires your personal attention? Sincerely yours, Mark Flamenhoft in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Also in the files are several pages from Sirhan's personal diaries. Several entries in his diary, made over about a year-long period, are about his desire to kill certain politicians because of their support for Israel. He had it in his mind that he was going to kill President Lyndon Johnson over the Six-Day War, and also UN Ambassador Arthur Goldberg before he finally zeroed in on Kennedy. And I'm just going to read you an excerpt from this page that's kind of interesting. It says, I advocate the overthrow of the current president of the fucking United States of America. I have no absolute plans yet, but will soon compose some. And he goes on to write, I believe that the U.S. is already in decline. Not that it hasn't. It began on November 23rd, 1963. He's obviously referring to the assassination of President Kennedy there, but he got the date wrong. It was November 22nd, not November 23rd. He writes, he goes on to say, I firmly support the communist cause and its people, whether Russian, Chinese, etc. Immediately after the assassination in June of 1968, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, sent out a call across the Arab world asking Arab lawyers to come forward and defend Sirhan. One such lawyer was Libyan Mahmoud Nafi, who offered his services. This telegram from the State Department shows, of course, that the State Department was watching all of this very, very closely. This one is from the embassy in Tripoli to the Secretary of State in Washington and copied to U.S. embassies in Amman, Jordan, and in Benghazi. As Robert F. Kennedy lay comatose in a hospital on June 5th, 1968, still alive but just barely, the fifth grade class of a New York elementary school wrote this letter to President Lyndon Johnson, who was a former school teacher himself, saying that giving presidential candidates Secret Service protection wasn't the solution. Harsh criminal justice was. Of course, President Johnson, just the day before, as soon as Robert Kennedy was shot, he signed an executive order guaranteeing Secret Service protection to all presidential candidates on the campaign trail for the very first time. Unfortunately, as you probably know, at the time of Senator Kennedy's murder, he did not have Secret Service protection. So Lyndon Johnson removed that barrier by executive order, and then Congress later codified that into law. A few days later, on June 9th, Mrs. James Esposito of Tulsa, Oklahoma, wrote this letter to President Johnson. This is just 3 days after RFK's death, urging swift justice for Sirhan. And, she's expressing her frustration with LBJ's apparent tolerance, she says, for riots and arson and looting and violence and lawlessness on the streets. and closes her letter saying, "My son is fighting in Vietnam, trying to keep our country safe for democracy. I hope he and the others are not over there fighting in vain." And you know, these files are so interesting, the White House correspondence files, just to get the feeling of the American people, how the anger, the rage, the confusion, the suspicions of a conspiracy, it's all there literally on the day that Bobby died, and in the days and weeks after that. The White House was just flooded with letters, and many of them were written by small children, which are just amazing to read, and I'm going to share some of those with you as we go today. As Senator Kennedy lay dying in the hospital on June 5th, a group of concerned citizens sent this telegram to Attorney General Ramsey Clark expressing their outrage. Quote, "Please do not try to tell the American public there is no evidence of a conspiracy in the attempted assassination of Robert Kennedy when you haven't even had time to investigate. You should assume there is a conspiracy in all of these assassinations until proven otherwise. The great and numerous middle-class people in this country are aroused to protest the lawlessness and the violence rampant in this country. They say minority groups are running the country because men in high places evidently do not have the intestinal fortitude to stand for what's right." And what we're looking at here, there are several reports like this in the files because the FBI was assisting the LAPD in the early days of the investigation. They would periodically send reports back to headquarters in Washington, just keeping them abreast of what's going on in the investigation. So this is a June 24th, 1968 FBI memo providing updates on the case. And also, this is interesting that apparently Sirhan's attorney was requesting police protection after receiving some threatening phone calls from the Sirhan Clemency Committee, allegedly an Arab militia. As mentioned previously, 20-year-old Sandra Serrano appeared on television shortly after Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot and claimed that immediately after the shooting, a woman in a polka dot dress ran past her shouting, "We shot him, we shot him." According to Miss Serrano, this woman had entered the Ambassador Hotel prior to the shooting, accompanied by two men, one of whom she identified as Sirhan Bishara Sirhan. Extensive investigation has failed to substantiate her story. It goes on. On June 21st, 1968, after being afforded a polygraph examination and an extensive interview by the Los Angeles, California Police Department, Miss Serrano admitted that her story was a complete fabrication. Also, down at the bottom of the memo, it says, the receptionist at the office of Russell E. Parsons, Sirhan's attorney in Los Angeles, received 2 telephone calls on June 20th from a person claiming to be John Lawrence of New York City. This caller said he was executive secretary of the Clemency Committee for Sirhan, and that Los Angeles criminal attorneys are all crooks and will take Sirhan, quote, down the river. He also said, quote, "We are out to get Mr. Parsons," and claimed that Parsons was being paid $150,000, that was a lot of money in 1968, to represent Sirhan. He said that there are 250,000 Arabs who are militant and who are not going to let Parsons, quote, get away with it. Parsons contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and immediately requested protection. The police suggested that he discuss the matter with the presiding judge, Los Angeles County Superior Court. The presiding judge intends to hold a hearing to determine if Parsons needs protection. And here is another interesting diary entry that was found at Sirhan's home. On this page, he writes over and over and over, "Kennedy must fall. Kennedy must fall. Senator R. Kennedy must be disposed of. We believe," I don't know who we is, but he refers to we quite a bit. "We believe that Robert F. Kennedy must be sacrificed for the cause of the poor, exploited people. We believe that we can effect such action and produce such results. The hand that is writing, that is doing this writing, is going to do the slaying of the above-mentioned victim. One wonders what it feels like to do any assassination that might do some illegal work. I know that doesn't make any sense, but a lot of Sirhan's diary entries just don't make any sense. And then it says at the bottom of the page, many times over, Kennedy must die, Kennedy must fall, Kennedy must fall, Kennedy must fall. Another page here from Sirhan's diary. These are undated entries, but they're obviously before the assassination, where he writes about his plans to do away with American leaders. Again, from the president to Vice President Hubert Humphrey to UN Ambassador Goldberg, in addition to Senator Robert Kennedy, all because of their support for Israel. And here he's raging about what we're doing in Vietnam, how the economy is just based on war spending and all of these various complaints. And he says, well, my solution to this type of government is that to do away with its leaders and declare anarchy. On the day that Senator Kennedy was shot, the actress Shelley Winters sent this telegram to President Johnson requesting that the alleged assassin be carefully protected, obviously fearing another Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby situation. She writes, "Dear President, as you know, I have worked very hard as a dedicated Democrat all my adult life, and I urge you to make the protection of the assailant of Robert Kennedy a national matter and not a city or state concern. Sincerely, Shelley Winters." Little did she know then that Sirhan was her neighbor in Pasadena. And this document was found at Sirhan's home in Pasadena. I think it was actually found in the trash dumpster outside, where maybe someone in his family, had tried to hide it or dispose of it before a search warrant was actually obtained. And in fact, the Sirhan family later protested that search, saying that the police did not have a warrant when they showed up the next day. But the police, and this argument won with the judge, they said that, that someone in the Sirhan family, apparently one of Sirhan's brothers, gave the police permission to enter and search the premises. This particular document actually is not a new discovery. It was evidence presented at his 1969 trial and then publicly released in 1988. So this was in the California State Archives, but it's pretty damning evidence. It is an envelope, as you can see, from the IRS. And he wrote, and that's his handwriting, on the envelope, "RFK must be disposed of like his brother was." Now, this is really interesting. It's a news clipping that was in these files from the very day that RFK was shot. He was literally in the hospital dying. And yet another plot to murder him, along with President Lyndon Johnson and civil rights leaders like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP and Whitney Young of the Urban League. Another plot was reportedly afoot, according to testimony given June 5th, 1968, in a Queens, New York courtroom. I'm just going to read you a little bit of this. It's a UPI Wire story. It says, Senator Robert F. Kennedy's name was injected yesterday in the Queens conspiracy to murder trial as being on a list of, quote, people who should be assassinated. The quote was attributed to Herman Ferguson, a defendant in the trial, by Detective Edward Howlett, a police undercover agent. It says here, and I apologize for the language, it says the Negro detective, which is how newspapers referred to black people back then. It says the Negro police detective testified that on May 18th, 1967, he, Ferguson, and Arthur Harris, the other defendant, discussed a list of selective terrorism. And then, despite the defense objecting, the detective was allowed to enter names that were on that list. And this was a year before that the list was written, apparently. And in his testimony, that detective said that Ferguson once told him, quote, "After Roy Wilkins is killed, we might decide to get our president, Lyndon Johnson." Crazy times in the United States, my friends. And this is another interesting FBI spot report, as they called it. And this is June 6th, 1968, as Senator Kennedy's body was being flown back home on LBJ's Air Force Two. The LAPD had a couple of updates on the case for the FBI. The Los Angeles Police Department, it says, has issued an all-points bulletin for a female Caucasian, aged 23 to 27, height 5'6", who was believed to have been accompanying Sirhan Sirhan prior to the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. That would be the lady in the polka dot dress. And in fact, everybody was looking for her, at least in those initial days following the shooting. But it's point B that's really interesting. It says that LAPD arrested an as-yet unidentified male suspect approximately 100 yards from the presidential plane at Los Angeles International Airport. The suspect stated that it was his intention to kill the remainder of the Kennedy family. It was not known by the agent on the scene if the suspect was armed. The agent on the scene did not see the arrest personally, but the suspect was taken to a police substation at the airport and was presently being interrogated by the intelligence division of the Los Angeles Police Department. And we never heard of that guy again. Just one of those mysteries of the case. Whatever happened to that guy, and whatever indeed happened to Sirhan's alleged lady friend in the polka dot dress. This particular document is very interesting in light of President Trump's DOJ's deportations right now of student visa holders who are members of pro-Palestinian groups. In 1968, the Department of Justice was looking very closely at Sirhan's campus activism as a potential tie to Arab terror groups overseas. This is a very interesting letter from a Ernest Schaefer to Ramsey Clark, Attorney General of the United States. And I'm just going to quote a little bit of this letter. It says, "As outlined above, the assassin was a member of an Arabic student organization. And as we have seen in this country, that students in general are getting somewhat restless, and young people from the Middle East, due to their temperamental buildup, even more so. We also know for a fact that amongst the Arabian countries, there is a very radical and chauvinistic organization, Al-Fatah, which not only makes constant raids into Israel, but also threatens everybody who does not cooperate with them, including even King Faisal of Transjordan." The letter continues, "I cannot help but feel that a good deal of the Arabic student associations in this country are under the very strong influence of this terror organization and have been forced to interfere directly with the inner political affairs of our country by selecting prominent figures for assassination. Therefore, it seems impossible to me that only one man was assigned to kill the senator." The fact that in his pocket was the slip of paper stating that Senator Kennedy had to be killed before June 5th, the outbreak of last year's Middle East war anniversary, seems to indicate even stronger that the whole plot must have been organized in some way. And this internal FBI memo reports that obviously distraught Ethel Kennedy yelled at an ambulance technician to keep your dirty, filthy hands off my husband, and was refusing to let the technicians actually help RFK, and that story's been corroborated many times over the years. So it says, according to an interview with that ambulance attendant, a Max Berman, he had responded to the call at the Ambassador Hotel, and she's telling him to keep your hands off my husband, and they get into an argument in the ambulance while RFK is being rushed to the hospital. And he was questioning Ethel, while en route to the hospital as to what had transpired back at the hotel. She said, quote, "I don't give a damn what you say," grabbed his record book, threw it out of the ambulance while they're speeding down the road. And so he noticed that the senator was having difficulty breathing and was trying to assist him, but he was told by Mrs. Kennedy, "You keep your dirty, filthy hands off my husband." And then she struck him on the right side of his face, which of course stunned him. He further recalled Mrs. Kennedy called to a male associate who was sitting in the front seat to come back here and throw this ambulance man out. "He's bothering me. He's asking too many questions." It was further reported by a witness at the hospital that upon arrival there, Mrs. Kennedy grabbed a camera from a newsman, knocking it to the floor, and she also swung at the newsman, hitting him in the chest. Senator Kennedy's bodyguard, Bill Barry, then jumped over the stretcher and punched the newsman squarely in the face. That's how crazy things were that night, folks. On Inauguration Day, 1969, I picked out this document because it's a very emotional letter from a Georgia woman to the new president, Richard Nixon. She said, "Today, when you took your oath, I wondered what your thoughts were. Mine were that if an assassin's bullet had not taken away the life of Robert F. Kennedy, he would have stood where you did. I am certain a thought like that must have crossed your mind, too." She closes her letter, "Assuage some of my heartbreak at the loss of the Kennedys and see that Sirhan comes to justice and to hell as soon as you can." And that's just one of hundreds of letters that flooded into the White House after RFK's murder. We are getting to finally read these letters now for the very first time. And in this one from January of 1969, this one just breaks my heart. The trial of Sirhan had been delayed. For 7 months this went on. And this letter, handwritten in a child's handwriting, says, "Dear President Nixon, my name is blank," obviously redacted. We think that kid's probably still alive. "I am 10 years old. I would like you to tell me what takes so long for someone to be brought to trial. Take Sirhan. I wanted Bobby Kennedy for president before he got shot, but I want to know why it took so long for him to be brought to trial. Please answer me. Thank you, Marjorie Shear, Maplewood, New Jersey." There were numerous letters to Presidents Johnson and Nixon expressing outrage at Sirhan's continuous delays at getting to trial. Some were just outraged that he had any due process rights at all because he was an immigrant from Palestine and not a U.S. citizen. Some, like this correspondent, wanted to send Sirhan straight to death. Just bypass the trial, let's not even bother. This letter is dated January 11th, 1969. Dear Mr. Nixon, I was very strong on wanting Bobby Kennedy in the White House, but after he was shot by Sirhan, I was so sad and disappointed. I would like to know, why aren't they sending him straight to the gas chamber or the electric chair? He committed the crime of murder, and the whole world knows it. And it's interesting, though, in the margins at the bottom of the letter, it says, "What happened to peace?" Sirhan's trial was postponed yet again in January of 1969 when it was supposed to get underway. He kept changing out lawyers, and then Grant Cooper, of course, became lead attorney on the case. And this just caused even more frustration and fury among Americans, especially because you have to remember that James Earl Ray, who was the accused killer of Dr. Martin Luther King, managed to evade authorities and took them on a wild goose chase. He was on the loose for 2 months after the shooting of MLK before he was finally apprehended at London's Heathrow Airport. So there was this feeling in the air that law enforcement and the justice system were failing us. And this is a press clipping that I wanted to bring to your attention because, Sirhan's trial, once it finally did get underway in February of 1969, a lot of people have wondered if it was televised. Of course, the judge did not allow any public television, but this is kind of interesting that the judge, Herbert Walker, actually allowed a sort of closed circuit television setup because the courtroom was too small for all of this media that was coming from all over the world to cover the trial. So they set it up as a concealed camera in the courtroom, and then there were receivers in an auxiliary courtroom on another floor. So that there I guess there was no recording of it. Obviously, there are no tapes that exist of the trial. Wouldn't it be great if there were? Unfortunately, there are not. This is a letter to Sirhan from a pissed off American, written the day after Election Day, 1968. From a pen dripping with sarcasm, the writer blames Sirhan for handing the country to Nixon. This letter is dated November 6th, 1968, and I'm just going to read it because it's really, really good. Dear Sir Han, having removed an all but unsurmountable obstacle from the path of the Republican presidential candidate, you have not only earned the gratitude of conservative Americans, but become the undisputed kingmaker in this year's presidential contest. Your service to the cause of anti-communism has been of uncalculable magnitude and will not soon be forgotten by the military planners who have worked so hard to escalate a minor civil war in Asia into an ideological confrontation of major proportions. The skillful elimination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy from the political scene and the prevention of an impending Kennedy landslide were executed in the aggressive spirit of your great compatriot, Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who as early as 1942 recognized the extent of the communist menace. This noted Arab nationalist supported Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union unequivocally, and it can be assumed that many of his Arab followers and other right-wing extremists look upon the war in Vietnam as being a continuation of this original anti-communist crusade. Your bold action has altered the course of history. The world trembles in contemplation of the ominous consequences of your morbid deed. Signed, Carl Zirk, Los Angeles, California. At Sirhan's 1969 trial, his mother, Mary Sirhan, testified about her son's traumatic childhood, witnessing as a small boy the horrors of war during the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1948. And as evidenced by letters such as this to the Attorney General of the United States, Americans weren't sympathetic. This letter is unsigned, so this citizen obviously wanted to remain anonymous. It is written to Attorney General Mitchell, of course. It's the Nixon administration now, so new Attorney General. And they attached a copy of a news clipping about Sirhan's mother's testimony in court. And this person writes, "It is tragic, of course, that many children have unhappy homes and consequently develop resentful and distorted adult dispositions. However, the fact remains that anyone who commits a murder is temporarily insane. In other words, has lost control of his emotions. No matter what his background, it's dangerous to law-abiding citizens. There should be a law enacted immediately to void the possibility of using the temporarily insane and similar defense arguments to acquit these people who commit crimes because they cannot control their emotions." As you've seen in previous episodes of the Who Killed Bobby Kennedy series, we covered this in great detail. Sirhan was hailed as a hero in Arab nations for his killing of Robert Kennedy. He inspired terror groups like Black September and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, who later took hostages in Sirhan's name, hijacked aircraft, took hostages in our embassy in Khartoum, and they would always demand his release from prison and return to Jordan or to Palestine. So this is a letter, another citizen letter, to Attorney General John Mitchell, dated April 17th, 1969, the day that Sirhan was found guilty by the jury. Dear Sir, is it true that the Justice Department is thinking of making a deal with the country of Jordan to release Sirhan upon his conviction to them for an exchange of someone? If so, who is that someone that he is more important than the murderer of Robert F. Kennedy? The letter continues. The shocking fact that Sirhan has been proclaimed a hero in the Arab states for killing a human being in cold blood was almost too much for me to bear. But then, upon learning the news that the Justice Department of the United States of America was actually considering a deal to give him back to Jordan, fills me with such disgust and contempt for my country that I had to write you this letter and ask this question. Will he be sent to a Jordanian prison or be allowed to just walk the streets and enjoy the fruits of his most horrible deed? No matter what, let's forget the oil that's in Jordan. Let's forget the Middle East crisis, because it will erupt anyway, and let us save America's little precious dignity that she has left and not perform such a disgusting act. As an American, as a taxpayer, as a simple human being, I deplore the Justice Department for even considering such an injustice. Mere words fail me. With deep regret, Miss Janet Bruders. Now, of course, there were also many angry letters to the Justice Department, to the White House, to the Attorney General, complaining about the cost of this long, drawn-out trial and protecting Sirhan and all of that, that the American taxpayers were picking up the bill. But actually, American taxpayers were not picking up the bill because this was a state crime. California taxpayers, though, were quite outraged, too, at footing the bill of more than $1 million for Sirhan's lengthy trial and even paying for a 3-room prison suite for Sirhan, including a private cook. One angry Californian sent a clipping from her local newspaper to President Nixon saying, "Read this." So this was a 3-cell suite being built especially for Sirhan, supposedly to keep him safe. These are pretty large quarters, walled off from the other prisoners, which had a kitchen, a dining room, a bedroom, a living room, and a private bathroom with a shower. Each cell of these 3 cells are about 10 by 15 feet. One was a kitchen equipped with a stainless steel stove and oven where uniformed prison personnel would cook Sirhan's meals. This would, they said, eliminate the risk of someone trying to poison his food. The second cell would be a living room equipped with a TV set where Sirhan could receive visitors. And the third cell would be Sirhan's bedroom and then a private bath off the kitchen. The paper reported the cost of imprisoning Sirhan and keeping a 24-hour watch on him would far outstrip the $2,800 a year spent on average prisoners. In the late 1960s, not many Americans understood the Middle East conflict, which led Sirhan to murder Senator Kennedy. The minority who did comprehend the gravity of the broader Cold War situation were American Jews, such as Joel Spiegelman, who wrote this letter to President Nixon. This was written in February of 1969 while Sirhan's trial was ongoing. It says, "Dear Mr. President, the Soviet Union is securing a stronghold for herself in the Middle East. by supplying arms to the Arab states and by sending military experts and engineers to the Arab armies to advise in the use of those weapons, she is creating an enormous military menace in the Middle East and making Soviet satellites out of Arab countries. This is a threat to American interests in that area and to the cause of democracy throughout the whole world. Yet, the United States joins with Russia in United Nations resolutions and refuses to act in accordance with the seriousness of the situation. Our government must recognize the situation in the Middle East as it is, and we must act accordingly. I strongly urge the establishment of a strong commitment to the only democratic state in the Middle East, Israel. The United States must supply Israel with arms comparable to those being given the Arab states by Russia, and must support her in diplomatic circles. The Soviet action in Czechoslovakia indicates Russia's interests and her methods. We must not let Israel down. Sincerely yours, Joel Spiegelman. Another interesting letter, this one dated March 4th, 1970, to the Attorney General, John Mitchell, at the Department of Justice. Dear Sirs, it has come to my attention that the murderer of Robert F. Kennedy is still living. In the midst of scores of people, one Mr. Sirhan committed cold-blooded murder. May I ask why it is so hard to convict and execute such filthy vermin? You may think that I am some kind of radical person bent on seeing people die. It so happens that I am merely a 14-year-old boy that is interested in seeing justice prevail. Name redacted, probably because that 14-year-old boy is still living. This document here is an excellent brief summary of the Sirhan murder trial, which was prepared for the Department of Justice in 1969. And I've taken a few screenshots. It's a long report. I wanted to go over a few really wild moments from this three-ring circus of a trial. My favorite moment in the trial of Sirhan happened on February 20th, 1969, when Sirhan's defense attorney at the beginning of that court session that day moved for a mistrial for the second time based on some local press accounts that Sirhan was willing to plead guilty to first-degree murder if he could be assured of a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death in the gas chamber. But that day in court, Sirhan, just out of the blue, stands up in court, addresses the judge directly. His attorney tells him to sit down and be quiet, and then he requested permission to approach the bench, and the jury was excused from the room, and Sirhan requested permission to speak and indicated a desire to change his plea to guilty to murder in the first degree. He also requested to be executed and to disassociate himself from his present staff of defense attorneys. He then turns to the judge and says out loud in court that he had, quote, willfully killed Senator Robert F. Kennedy after 20 years of premeditated malice aforethought. Sirhan then continues that he is going to fire all of his lawyers and represent himself. And the judge declared him incompetent to defend himself. The judge ruled that the trial would continue, and he admonished Sirhan that if there were any further outbursts like that in the courtroom, he would have to be physically restrained in court. So then court reconvenes, and defense attorney Grant Cooper, speaking for himself and all of Sirhan's defense lawyers, made a motion that all of the defense lawyers in this case be disassociated from it due to differences of opinion between themselves and their client, Sirhan. This motion was denied by the judge. He was having none of it. The trial was ordered to proceed. This poor judge had a headache at this point. As we've talked about in previous episodes, it was such a circus atmosphere. This trial in the spring of '69, at the same time down in New Orleans, you had another circus trial going on with Jim Garrison, who was prosecuting Clay Shaw for possible conspiracy in the assassination of JFK. So both of these trials were going on at the same time. In September 1970, as we discussed in episode 2 and other previous episodes of Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, a group of Palestinian terrorists hijacked 5 airliners, taking hundreds of passengers hostage. The hijackers demanded that President Nixon release Sirhan from prison in exchange for the hostages. During the height of the hostage crisis, there was one particularly upset American who wrote this letter to President Nixon on, of all dates, September 11th, 1970. Dear Sir, do not release Sirhan under any circumstances. Now, of course, Richard Nixon could do nothing about it as President of the United States. That responsibility rested on the shoulders of California's governor, Ronald Reagan, at the time, who, of course, refused to let Sirhan out of prison. But if you'd like to learn more, if this is a new story for you, there is a lot more information about that September 1970 PFLP skyjacking, an event which many historians call the blueprint for 9/11 2001, and the terrorists' demands for Sirhan's release in exchange for hostages. You know, Sirhan's murder of Senator Kennedy inspired numerous terrorist hijackings and hostage takings all throughout the 1970s. Famously, RFK's eldest son, Joseph Kennedy, was himself taken hostage during a 1972 skyjacking. All of these events are talked about pretty extensively in episode 13 of the series. That's my interview with Sirhan's biographer, British author Mel Ayton. A year later, in 1973, the Black September terrorist group took 10 hostages at our embassy in Khartoum, Sudan, 3 of them American diplomats. And again, they demanded Sirhan's release. The United States, President Nixon, refused to negotiate. The hostages were tortured and killed. What we're looking at here is a angry citizen's letter to the president that's quite profound. I'll read you a little of it. This letter is dated April 24th, 1973. Dear Mr. President, congratulations on not giving in to blackmail. Sirhan is considered by the Black September group to be one of them, and they consider him your hostage. If they kill their hostages, then they should expect that you will execute Sirhan, your hostage. Sirhan is a convicted murderer. He should have been executed at the time of his conviction. You have stated that the Black September group should be punished, and you have one of their members as a hostage. Therefore, it is a very good time to carry out the execution of Sirhan. This is the only fitting punishment for international outlaws, the only one they understand. As long as Sirhan lives, he will be used again and again and again to justify the murder of Americans. Already, Senator Kennedy and these 3 American diplomats have fallen because of Sirhan. Respectfully submitted, Owen C. Neal. And it seems that Mr. Neal had a crystal ball, because indeed this did happen again and again and again over the next 2 decades, leading up to, of course, 9/11 and many acts of terrorism since that time. It's interesting to point out that Sirhan was on death row. He had been given the death penalty by the jury back in 1969, but in 1972, California, for a time, outlawed the death penalty, and that's when Sirhan's death sentence was commuted to life in prison, which is why he still sits in prison today at age 81. Inside these RFK file boxes, you find a lot of press clippings that the FBI, the DOJ, the State Department were keeping copies of, just staying abreast of what the media was writing about the trial of Sirhan. This one is dated March 22nd, 1969. This was coverage of his trial in the Associated Press. It's an interesting story. and it's a true story, that during Sirhan's trial, his defense team tried getting him drunk to induce that same state of mind that he was in the night that RFK was shot. One of the many defenses that Sirhan and his lawyers tried was, well, I was intoxicated and I blacked out and I was so drunk I don't remember what I did. Sirhan claims that he had 4 Tom Collins drinks. And so they tried to get him drunk in his jail cell one night. A Dr. Eric Marcus told the jury that in this test, Sirhan was given 6 ounces of alcohol in a Tom Collins cocktail. Now, I presume the alcohol they used was gin, and usually a Tom Collins has about 2 ounces of gin per drink. Sirhan claimed he had 4 Tom Collinses. That would have been 8 ounces. So they actually gave him a little bit less than the amount that he claimed to have consumed the night of June 4th, 1968. Dr. Marcus, the psychiatrist, said during this test that psychologically he went berserk. He was extremely agitated and restless and cursing and had to be physically restrained. He kept grabbing at his throat. He said, "What the hell is going on here?" He thought he was choking. He said, "I'll get even with those Jews." Dr. Marcus continued on the stand, quote, "I think Sirhan thought he was back at the Ambassador Hotel. Then he started talking about how 20 years was enough for the Jews and Kennedy didn't have to help them. He never said that he killed Kennedy. He kept talking as though Kennedy were alive. He said, 'That bastard isn't worth the bullet.' With all my prodding, he never said he killed Kennedy," the psychiatrist testified. He goes on and says the alcohol triggered off some kind of a irritation. He became sort of like a wild beast. Under cross-examination earlier, Dr. Marcus did concede that it was, quote, "quite possible Sirhan was lying when he claimed he could not remember the night of June 5th, 1968. Now, this is a fascinating find in the White House boxes of the new RFK files. It's a letter to President Richard Nixon from a fellow inmate of Sirhan's at San Quentin Prison, dated February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1973. It reads, "Mr. President, since I came to this prison in 1971, I have had several lengthy conversations with Sirhan, who had been convicted of assassinating Senator Robert Kennedy in 1968. I have also obtained from Sirhan several statements personally handwritten and signed by Sirhan himself. These are historical documents. Last week, I have been contacted by numerous prominent persons who were interested to have a copy of these documents. It is not possible for them to have the original. I have sent such to Mr. Kennedy," I presume that means Senator Ted Kennedy, "and Mr. Onassis. The reason for me to write to you this letter is that in the documents, Sirhan mentions the names of 2 persons who allegedly were associated with you in 1968 and who, according to Sirhan, were involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Senator Robert Kennedy. Of course, there are reasonable causes to disbelieve these allegations made therein. However, since this is a serious matter, I deemed it wise to notify you about it. Yours truly, Vladimir Alexander Zutko, San Quentin State Prison." This is an FBI memo in late May of 1968, roughly a week before the assassination. The owner of a local bar reportedly overheard Sirhan saying, "We will wait until he," meaning Senator Kennedy, "comes into town, then we'll get him." One wonders who was the "we." Apparently, the name of this establishment indicates that it might be a striptease kind of place. It was called the Golden Garter Bar, located at 2605 West Valley Boulevard in Alhambra, California. And someone matching Sirhan's description, the co-owner of the bar, said they were sure that that was Sirhan who said that. By that time, Senator Kennedy's travel plans were already made and were being publicized. So it is indeed, it does fit with Sirhan's journals, his diaries, and the dates on those, showing that he was keeping a close watch on where Robert Kennedy was going and when he would be coming to Los Angeles next. The saddest irony of the RFK assassination, to me anyway, is that Robert Kennedy refused protection from Los Angeles police and Ambassador Hotel security on the night that he was killed. And this document here is an FBI interview with the chief of security for the Ambassador Hotel, and I'll just read you a little bit of that. He advised that Senator Kennedy had been a guest at the hotel on previous occasions during the present campaign, and that during his previous visits to the hotel, it was made clear to him, Mr. Gardner, who was chief of security, that the senator did not want any uniformed security guards in his presence, nor did he want any armed individuals as his bodyguards. Mr. Gardner said this is one of the reasons why he did not have any guards assigned to escort Senator Kennedy through the hotel during this unfortunate visit in June of '68. And to double the irony, only one armed security guard was actually protecting Bobby Kennedy on that fateful night, and that man's name was Thane Eugene Caesar. He was a rent-a-cop from an outside security company. Gene Caesar, over the years, who died in 2019, has been accused of shooting RFK by some of the conspiracy researchers, and we've devoted a couple of episodes to that in the series as well. It is important to point out Thane Caesar maintained his innocence until his death. And was he what he always claimed to be, a man falsely accused? Well, if you're curious, check out episode 11, my interview with Craig Colgan, journalist, and also episode 13 in my interview with author Mel Ayton. Of course, prior to 1968, presidential candidates didn't receive Secret Service protection. In fact, it was only hours after the RFK assassination, President Johnson ordered Secret Service for all candidates. Congress later codified that into law. You're probably wondering why the brother of an assassinated president would not want an armed security detail. There's a couple of reasons. One, of course, the primary reason was that as senator, RFK was supporting the Gun Control Act of 1968 and thought he would look hypocritical if he had armed guards around him in public. The other reason, of course, was this was the height of the anti-establishment hippie movement that was supporting Bobby Kennedy. They didn't trust cops, they didn't trust the man, and Bobby thought it would be bad optics to be surrounded by a bunch of armed guards. This document, it is a translated text of an interview with the father of Sirhan about 2 weeks after the assassination. This appeared in a Jordanian newspaper, of course. That's where the family had immigrated to the United States from. The newspaper was called Ad-Difa, and I'm going to read you some excerpts from this article. It's very, very interesting. At 2 p.m. yesterday, Ad-Difa learned that Mr. Bishara Sirhan, father of Sirhan, arrived in Amman, Jordan from the West Bank on a permit issued by the occupation authorities, it says. This reporter spent over 2 hours talking with Sirhan's father, and here are some excerpts from the interview. It says, Bishara Sirhan was sitting calmly and talking confidently. You could detect in his tone parental emotions. The murder of Senator Kennedy saddened me because he was from the Kennedy family, but the picture has a second face. Which? The reporter asked. The political face, said Mr. Sirhan, for the senator was also an American politician, so on this I have a view to express. Please. I believe that the imbalance in Senator Kennedy's speeches while electioneering for the presidency was the primary cause of what happened. How? The reporter asked. He was promising certain parties to supply them with arms, an aircraft, with full awareness of the consequences of that promise. Its consequences would be more displacement of children, more orphans, and more widows. This is in addition to the degradation of and contempt for the Arabs in his speeches, a thing that made my son Sirhan feel insulted in the society where Senator Kennedy was speaking. And this is what pushed my son to act as he did. Had the late senator been reserved and merely called for peace in the Middle East, nothing would have happened. The reporter asked, "Are you furious with Sirhan?" In the first moments after I learned of the incident, I was furious. And now, my heart and mind are now with him. I believe that world opinion and human conscience will stand by him. I still believe my son is innocent despite the accusations. But even if we suppose he did it, we must examine the motives and reasons that led him to such an act. His love for his homeland and religion must have overcome everything else and incited him to act. I do not support violence or political assassination, but Kennedy was rash in his statements. I also say that the conscience of America and its courts and world public opinion will stand by Sirhan. Sirhan has seen destruction and death in his own country, referring to Palestine, which last suffered war in 1967. In spite of the fact that Sirhan left for America in 1957 and lived over 10 years in American society, his religion and homeland were constantly on his mind. The late Senator Kennedy was the man who lit the fuse of the mine inside my son, Sirhan. On June 6, 1968, the day that RFK died, FBI agents took a chilling statement from a man named Stephen Dale Ahern, former member of the American Nazi Party, who confessed to making death threats against RFK earlier that same year. Ahern told his shrink that he had felt an urge to kill RFK. Quoting from the statement that Mr. Ahern gave the FBI, it says, "I, Stephen Dale Ahern, called the Greek Theater in March of 1968 at 1:45 p.m. on the day prior to the scheduled speaking appearance of Senator Robert Kennedy. When the operator at the Greek Theater," that's in Los Angeles, by the way, "answered the telephone, I said, 'There is a bomb inside. It will go off tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 p.m. I knew prior to making this bomb threat that the senator was to address a rally at the Greek Theater at 4:15 p.m., the day after I made the telephone call." The statement continues, "Later that same day, at approximately 4 p.m., I telephoned the Los Angeles Times and told whoever answered the telephone that Senator Kennedy will be shot." Both of the aforementioned phone calls were made from a public phone booth in Sylmar, California. At approximately 1 p.m., I telephoned American Airlines at Los Angeles International Airport and told whoever answered the telephone, "Senator Kennedy will be shot when he lands." This call to the airport was made from a public phone booth on Laurel Canyon Boulevard in San Fernando, California. Immediately after making the telephone call to the Los Angeles airport, I drove to the airport and saw Senator Kennedy land, and was even able to shake his hand. After having seen the senator at the airport, I drove to the Greek Theater, where I observed the entire Kennedy family. So it sounds like, of course, he's mentally ill because he's a Nazi, but he just sounds like a mentally ill stalker, admits that he's under the care of a psychiatrist, and that he was having these strange thoughts that he himself couldn't quite explain, these urges to kill Senator Kennedy. And I think the FBI wrote him off as anybody who seriously would have been a threat to RFK. But files like this are so interesting, aren't they? It shows the mental illness in America in 1968 and just how crazy things were and how many different threats and plots had been made against Senator Kennedy's life during the campaign of 1968. Most of them were crackpots or harmless or pranksters, but it only takes one, as we found out, to end someone's life. Thane Eugene Caesar, the security guard assigned to protect Senator Kennedy and who many conspiracy theorists believe actually shot RFK, including his son, RFK Jr. It's interesting that Thane Eugene Caesar did not leave the scene of the crime that night. He stuck around the hotel for hours, talking to police investigators, gave an interview, went down to the Rampart station, talked to the FBI, and he even talked to several reporters who were back there in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen. This is in the news clipping files of the RFK documents from the Washington Evening Star, June 5th, 1968. And here we have an interview with Gene Caesar, a 26-year-old special security officer, as he's described. And these are his quotes. This is what he told the paper. "I was holding his arm. We were coming through the crowd. The senator reached out to shake hands with someone in the direction where the gunman was standing. When he reached out, this man, a short man, held his arm up high over the senator's aides who were in front of him. He fired 5 shots. I fell back and pulled the senator with me. He slumped to the floor on his back. I was off balance and fell down, and when I looked up, about 10 people already had grabbed the assailant. They started clubbing and beating and kicking the guy. I turned around to the senator and saw that there was blood on the right side of his head." Unquote. This also comes from the Washington Evening Star, same article from June 5th, 1968. And this photograph is really hard for me to look at. Probably the most graphic close-up that I've ever seen of my late friend, Paul Schrade, who was a Kennedy labor organizer on the campaign. He was shot that night, took a bullet to his head, and he's seen here bleeding out on the Ambassador Hotel kitchen floor. Luckily, Paul did make a full recovery, lived to the ripe old age of 97, and he fought tirelessly for the release of many of these documents you're looking at now. You're looking at them because Paul Schrade sued the government in California and eventually got these files released to the public. The most fascinating thing about the press clippings file in these new RFK documents, many of these even experienced researchers like myself have never seen before. And this particular article by the Boston Globe's reporter Robert Healy, he was in the room and he describes the pandemonium that he witnessed firsthand. And it's just probably the most compelling report that I think I've ever read about what happened in the kitchen that night. And it strikes me that Sirhan was damn lucky to leave the scene of the crime alive. I'm just going to read you a little bit from his piece. It says, "In that narrow, darkened corridor, there was terror, profanity, tears, blood, and the violence of a nation. I was standing on a steel serving table directly over the same place where we had just shaken hands, that is, he and Senator Kennedy. Now he lay there struck down by bullets. His right hand held a bleeding side. His face was white. His eyes were open. His lips moved just slightly. He did not cry." And he's describing the wrestling match with Rosie Greer and all of these men that jumped on Sirhan and they're wrestling with him. And he writes that another man atop the steam table was trying to kick the gunman, Sirhan, in the face. "Bastard," he said. "Kill him," someone shouted. And they would have. Of all of the thousands of pages I've read in these new RFK files, this one really got my attention. And I'm going to read it to you. You'll see why. We're into the State Department boxes now. This one from our embassy in London. It says, 1 week after the assassination on June 12th, 1968, a Mrs. Naomi Gross from Australia appeared voluntarily at the American Embassy in London, walked in and furnished the following information. It says, Mrs. Gross stated that she boarded a flight in Sydney, Australia at 7 p.m. on June 5th, 1968, en route to London. Given the time difference, that's kind of important because Australia is far ahead of Los Angeles. That would have been approximately 2 a.m. Los Angeles time, so about an hour and a half after the shooting of Robert Kennedy. Further, she stated she was traveling first class and had sat next to a man who said his name was Clifford Flitty, an American industrialist with Amarada Petroleum Company in Queensland, Australia. The company is supposedly an American-Canadian venture who worked out of the company's head office in Brisbane. Ms. Gross said Mr. Flitty also stated he was soon to become the new vice president of Union Carbide. The source described Clifford Flitty as a man of about 40 to 47 years, 5 feet 10 inches tall, weight about 170 pounds, gray hair, medium build, and wore glasses. She reported that the flight en route to London stopped at Fiji Island, Honolulu, San Francisco, New York, and then London. She said before the plane landed at Fiji Island, Clifford Flitty stated, quote, "I wish someone would put a bullet between Bobby Kennedy's eyes, and I wish I could pull the trigger myself." Further, the source stated that prior to their landing at Honolulu, the announcement of the Kennedy shooting was announced to the passengers by the captain. She also advised that when the plane later landed in San Francisco, there was to be a 4-hour layover, and it was in this time that the death of Robert Kennedy was announced. Further, she said that Clifford Flitty stated he was about to send a telegram to Senator Ted Kennedy, which was to read, "After 2, how about you?" and said he might even sign it with his name, and further stated, quote, "We will be rid of this trash forever." According to this woman, Mr. Flitty talked about ordering champagne to celebrate the tragedy. And it says here in the memo, attached as Exhibit 1 is the alleged note to be sent to Ted Kennedy in Mr. Flitty's own handwriting, but somehow that note did not make it into the file. So I can't show it to you because it's not there. Finally, it says, it is the opinion of the reporting agent, this State Department agent in London, that Mrs. Gross is a completely stable individual, was articulate in her speech, and gave every impression of being a highly intelligent woman. So obviously they took her report very seriously. And who was this Clifford Flitty? I was just so intrigued by this story. And where did he disappear to? So following the paper trail in the RFK files, this was an interesting rabbit hole to go down. The FBI and the State Department actually looked for him exhaustively for several months. And it seemed like they just weren't going to be able to track the guy down. Eventually they did. They interviewed him, and his interview's in here. It's actually pretty unremarkable. It seems as though they just didn't have anything to go on except this one woman's believable story about him and what he said to her on a flight. But they couldn't charge him with anything, and eventually they just let him go. This is a State Department cable from our embassy in Khartoum, and it's just kind of, this is like June 10th, 1968, just kind of advising Washington what the response is to the RFK assassination in the Middle East, especially in Jordan, in the Sudan. Of course, the State Department was very, very interested in how the Arab world would react when they found out that Sirhan was Jordanian or Palestinian. This same embassy was invaded by the Black September terrorist group in 1973, who demanded Sirhan's release from prison in exchange for the 3 American diplomats that they held hostage. President Nixon, of course, refused to negotiate with these terrorists, and they tortured and killed the hostages. Also, in these State Department boxes of RFK files are some voluminous file folders containing press clippings from around the world reporting on the assassination in the hours and days that followed, and many of them are translated into English. These are just absolutely fascinating glimpses of how the global community was affected by the assassination of Robert Kennedy. For example, this artwork, very powerful artwork from the Sunday Times of Malta, June 9th, 1968, The Vote of the Gun. Newspapers worldwide editorialized that America's guns were the problem and that something must be done about it. These cartoons, for example, appeared in the London Times right after the RFK assassination. And of course, it was due to the assassinations of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy that Congress passed the Gun Control Act of 1968 that October, and that was a measure that RFK himself had supported. These never-before-seen State Department cables from U.S. embassies around the world that provide a fascinating look at how RFK's murder was felt all over the globe. Most nations, of course, grieved, but some Arab nations openly celebrated Robert Kennedy's demise. Some June 1968 State Department cables and telegrams, there are many of them. I'm not going to show all of them to you here, but they show that Jordan, Sirhan's country, expressed, at least publicly and officially, great sorrow over Kennedy's murder by one of their own. Saudi Arabia, by contrast, of course, they were blaming a Zionist conspiracy for the assassinations of both RFK and JFK. Some interesting State Department telegrams from our embassy in London. These are regarding how Sirhan's act of murder incited the Arab world to rise up for the Palestinian cause against all Zionists and their allies. This one marked confidential. June 6th, Financial Times refers briefly to a statement attributed to Dr. Mohammed Mehdi, Secretary of Extremist Action Committee on American-Arab Relations. Mehdi reportedly said that his organization was appalled by Sirhan's act, but it reflected, quote, he said, the frustration of many Arabs with American politicians who have sold the Arab people of Palestine to the Zionist Jewish voters, unquote. It's interesting to note that Dr. Mehdi later became a longtime friend of Sirhan. And in light of today's headlines, as we are involved in more escalating tensions with Yemen, I found this in the RFK files. It's an editorial from the daily newspaper in Aden, Yemen, June 16th, 1968, where RFK was described as, quote, a victim of his own arrogance and his blind fanaticism for Israel. And it goes on to say, there are enough tragedies in our occupied lands to produce thousands of youths like Sirhan. When the jury unanimously condemned Sirhan to death in the gas chamber, large swaths of the Arab world expressed outrage, and there are a number of State Department telegrams like this one that just explain the headlines translated into English from newspapers across the Middle East and other Arab nations. For example, saying things like, Washington and its rulers would not dare to execute Sirhan if he were Jewish. Quote, but Washington taking measures to execute this brave man, Sirhan, of course, they considered him a brave man, they say, whose only fault was attempting to stop Americans from providing Israel with phantom aircraft, unquote. And in that same issue of Al-Masa, they ran an article by the well-known poet Al-Afani, in which he said, quote, Sirhan will not die. His memory will live on in the heart of jihad and in the hearts of strugglers until doomsday, unquote. Similar sentiment expressed in this article by a well-known Jordanian Anglican priest, Reverend Akel. His article was printed in Al-Difa, an Arabic daily, on May 14th, 1969, and in it he says, quote, deeply felt salutation to the soldier and the freedom fighter. The salute goes to the lion cub of the Palestine catastrophe, Sirhan Bishara Sirhan. We send it with the sound of our fighters' shots reverberating across the oceans to quake the death cell and shake America from the depths, unquote. And this is a State Department cable from our embassy in Beirut, September 1968. Sirhan's father, Bishara Sirhan, became sort of an activist for his son. He went on speaking tours, fundraising tours to several Arab countries before and during his son's trial. And this is, they were just keeping tabs on him. So in this report, back to Washington, it says, local press reports indicate Bishara Sirhan intends to visit a number of other Arab countries for the same purpose. Reportedly, he will visit Kuwait next. He told the Lebanese press on September 23rd that it was, quote, the duty of every Arab to help his son because this was the Arab cause. The main thesis Sirhan is propagating is that his son acted to serve, quote, the Palestinian cause, and that Sirhan is the son and the brother of every Arab, unquote. American embassies in Arab countries received form letters such as this one in Arabic, translated into English, during the RFK murder trial, saying, quote, we ask that the trial of Sirhan be just, taking into consideration the honorable motive which drove a noble youth to sacrifice his personal freedom for the cause of his people. And I finally made it through all 10,085 pages of the first RFK Files tranche. Whew! I'm going to give the last word, or closing argument, if you will, to Saul A. Dan, who's a former defense attorney for Lee Harvey Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby. Mr. Dan wrote on June 19th, 1968, this letter to Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He writes, quote, Sirhan is not the only Arab guilty of murder. Guilt is not restricted to the one who pulled the trigger. Guilt includes all those who triggered Sirhan's mind to act and caused him to suffer from irrational impulses, irresistible pressures, and mental disturbances that culminated into an act of violence. Those Arab misleaders like Nasser, that's the president of Egypt, who poisoned and polluted Sirhan's mind by filling him with the vicious hate and prejudice of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, he writes, are no less guilty than Sirhan. Many Arabs like Sirhan have been misled to believe that Israel is their enemy and the cause of their enslavement and poverty, that the mere existence of an Israel in the Middle East, regardless of its size or boundaries, prevents Nasser from establishing the entire Middle East into a united Arab republic that he claims would solve all the Arab problems. This Nazi type of propaganda has led many to irrational acts of violence and tragic murders similar to the recent Kennedy assassination. He says, the Sirhans were converted Christian Arabs living among Muslims in Israel and constantly subjected to and blinded by Nasser's false, vicious propaganda. What could be more confusing and frustrating? Sirhan is so mixed up about his Arab nationalism that he doesn't even know that his ancestors were not Jordanians. Jordan was only recently artificially created after his father was born. Jordan was carved out of the area for the proposed reestablishment of the Jewish state. The letter continues that Sirhan's anti-Zionism was merely another form of anti-Semitism. Limited space here prevents a detailed discussion of Sirhan's political, paranoid, anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. Suffice to say that the recent reestablishment of Israel could not be and is not responsible for the slavery and poverty suffered by the Arabs during the last 2,000 years. Some Arab states are over 1,000 miles away from Israel. Sirhan didn't stop to realize that Israel, Palestine, was a Jewish state over 3,000 years ago, and that it was never at any time in all of history an Arab national homeland, nor that there was any conflict of interest between Little Israel and the many vast Arab countries. But there are definite conflicts of interest between the different Arab leaders and the intrigues of various foreign powers competing with each other to exploit, missionize, and dominate the Arabs vis-a-vis the Russians, the Vatican, and the oil barons. It is impossible to compare on one foot the respective rights and plight of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from Arab countries as against the claims of the fugitives that Sirhan prefers to call Arab refugees, except to say that war is hell and creates problems that only peace can solve. The Sirhans twisted the Arab proverb, quote, "He who befriends my friend is also my friend," into "He who supports my enemy is also my enemy." Therefore, Nasser propagandized Arabs believe that they must murder every Israeli or any American, like Senator Kennedy, who supported Israel. If there were no Jews in the United States, it would still be our duty for our government to support a democratic state like Israel, to help establish world peace and freedom, and to protect our own American interests in the Middle East. Genocide that has caused the murder of millions of innocent people feeds on fanatic national and religious hates and prejudices. Therefore, anyone who teaches or encourages anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, be it nation, church, or individual, aided, abetted, and are no less guilty than Sirhan in the malicious, premeditated murder of United States Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Sincerely, Saul A. Dan. So, everybody, that's it. I hope you've enjoyed these highlights from the first tranche of 10,000 RFK assassination papers, and stay tuned. Another 50,000 documents are reportedly on the way, so I might be back with another episode of this series soon. Once again, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and catch up on previous episodes you might have missed in the playlist link down below. Thanks for watching Who Killed Bobby Kennedy? I'm Lori Spencer.